Hey everybody, Zero Brothers here with another video, and this one in response to a commenter who commented on our issue about our video about Ashley Babbitt, where we talked about the fact that the media is not painting her in the correct light. And as I was talking about this person commented very reasonably, just kind of wondering how can we really fairly compare the Capitol riots with the riots that went across the country, and how we can really make the statements that we make in that video, considering how extreme the right is. And so I wanted to talk about this, about whether it is whataboutism to compare Black Lives Matter riots to the Capitol riots. And I really wanted to respond with some care because the person who made that comment was very reasonable in how they said it. They didn't come across as somebody that was being arrogant or conceited or being high-handed in what they said. They really were giving an honest opinion, so I want to give an honest opinion in response and also a respectful opinion in response. So is it fair to compare the Black Lives Matter riots to the Capitol riots? And the person said, well, you can't compare the two because one occurred in the hot seat of the federal government and the other one didn't. Now, I think that's an interesting question because the person then made the second point of the Black Lives Matter riots, they occurred mainly against private property, but the Capitol riots were against federal property. And the obvious conclusion the person was trying to make is that federal property is more important than private property. Let me just kind of address that. Because when you're in the United States, is federal property more significant than private property? Now think about it in this sense. We have a government that is ruled by the people, for the people. In that sense, we don't have a government that pushes itself or should push itself as more important than the collective interest of the individual. In other words, the individual's rights and the individual's merit matter oftentimes more than the government itself. In fact, the premise of our system is that we want the government to have limits so that the individual can thrive. So if you look at it in that sense, the argument that federal lands are somehow more important than private lands is not a good argument, because that's the kind of argument you would make if you were in a dictatorship. That's the kind of argument you would make if you had a communist system. What the state does is more important than the individual. That's that kind of argument. So that kind of argument, it already assumes a false foundation, right? The other question about are the attacks on federal land versus private is because when you look at the protest of 2020 and some of the protests in 2021, there were some damages to federal buildings. And I'll just give it in this sense. When you look at the Capitol riots, it was about $1.5 million in damages. Now you can Google this, so you can look this up for yourself. Now be careful when you look this up, because when you look it up, a lot of stories will try to turn part of the cost of the damages into how much they had to pay the National Guard to come out. They'll do things like how much they did capital improvements or what they did to erect fences afterwards. And to me, I really don't count that as valid, the same way I don't count other things as valid. Let's say, you come to me and you break my house, you break my window. If my window cost me $200 to fix, I'm not going to also in that story talk about a $500 bill that I went to see my psychiatrist. I think that's a little bit adding on to more. And I can keep on adding cost on to the point where my cost can become ridiculous to the actual damages that you caused. So it's important to note that. So if you look at the actual physical damage that had to be repaired to the Capitol, it was about $1.5 million in damages versus Kenosha alone, right? And I'm talking about Kenosha alone. Kenosha, Wisconsin had its own riots and protests, $50 million of damages. That's just Kenosha alone. And when you talk about the protests that were spawned by the left versus the protests that were spawned by the right, they both were wrong. They both were wrong. But if you really want to have a fair conversation about this, you cannot have it without addressing truth. And the truth is this, that the left has done far more damage through protest and rioting than the right has. Now, you can change this around in other areas. I'm sure you can find some area where the right has done more damage than the left. But when you look at protest, It is very hard to look at this issue and not see that the left has caused far more damage, because that's just one city alone. In Portland, you want to talk about federal damage. In Portland, the protest caused about $2.3 million of damage to federal buildings alone. When you look at all the damages that went across the nation, it's pretty easy to understand that if you put it all on a scale and you put the capital damages versus the damages that went all around the country, that the left-leaning protests that were against the police or against Trump or whatever you might want to call it, they caused far more damages than the one that were on the right. Does that justify the ones on the right? No, it doesn't. No different than if I hit my mom and you hit your mom and your grandma. But my point would be is that there's one who did X amount of damage and the other one who did far more, right? It is not justifying either. It is just saying if you compare them. Can you compare them? Yes, you can. You can compare them because they're both riots. They're both protests that got out of control. Now, some people will counter and they say, hey, but the one in the Capitol is an insurrection. And I get that point, right? So somebody might say it's insurrection. Let's talk about what an insurrection is. The definition of an insurrection in the dictionary would encompass almost anything, right? So it's important for us to kind of define the terms, because if you look at an insurrection in that sense, an insurrection could be defined as an outrising of revolt, rebellion, or resistance against any authority. In that sense, the civil rights movement was an insurrection. So I think we have to be careful how we define the terms. We don't want to define the terms broadly in one case and strictly in another. So what do we mean by insurrection? Oftentimes in colloquial sense, right? In other words, when we're just sitting there talking to me and you, we just A and B having a conversation. What do we mean by insurrection? We essentially mean an attempt to replace the established government with a new government by force. And when you look at the Capitol riots, in that sense of the word insurrection, now I'm not talking about the technical definition, because in a technical sense, any resistance against the government could be considered an insurrection. In the sense that we use it colloquially, right? The riots that occurred in the Capitol would not be considered an insurrection because they did not attempt to establish a new government or remove those that were in power. And for you to make the argument that they were an insurrection, you would have to link those riots or protests to some desired outcome. Truth of the matter is that many of the people who broke into the Capitol left at their own will, right? They weren't arrested at the time. They were arrested later, after the fact. So a lot of those people did what they wanted to do in there, and they were idiots. They went in there and they broke into the Capitol and then they left. Some of the people were there, just looked and watched, right? So a lot of that did not have as its goal originally, let's break into the Capitol. That's what we're going to do. That wasn't really the goal. That's something that happened because, as it happens in most protests, a lot of protests get out of control. Now, compare that to Seattle, where they had protests, and then the protesters established what they call a Capitol Hill autonomous zone, where they did not allow a policing to occur. They did not allow emergency vehicles to freely enter. That could be considered what we might, in our own conversation, call an insurrection, because they attempted to establish a power in it and of themselves. And that was one of the goals of what they were trying to do. And that's what they actually achieved. So versus the Capitol ones where people went up and they tore and broke stuff. And then you got these riots in Seattle where they actually established an autonomous zone and called it such. That would be a better example of what in the media is called an insurrection than the Capitol riots. So comparing the two, you still can compare the two, right? You still can, even if you use terms like insurrection. And then the extremism, right? So some people say, well, of course we got to react that strong because of Trump's extremism. And let's just talk about what Trump's extremism means. Because I think a lot of times when people talk about extremism, I think they're talking about rhetoric and not actual policy. And that's why I have a fear that our system will ever be recovered. Because when you look at Trump's policies, in my opinion, whether you agree with them or not, you cannot call them extreme. Now, what you could do is be pissed off at the way that Trump might have said things, but to call his policies themselves extremist is not valid. And let's just look at some of the things he pushed. He pushed a wall. Now, it's hard for me to understand how anybody who can consider themselves an American could be against a wall. And the reason I will say that is because you can't play any video game where you have to defend yourself from somebody else, where it is not preferable to create a wall. You cannot build a house in any community where it is extremely rich without building some type of gate. You do not treat protecting your property seriously unless you erect some type of barrier around it to prevent people from just going in, if you really feel that there is a security concern. So the wall, why is that controversial? Let's just look through history and we look at the Great China Wall, right? The Great Wall of China, the fact that the Chinese built a wall to protect themselves from the Mongolians. Why? Because walls work. You need a barrier. It's just common sense. Israel has a wall, right? Lots of nations have walls. Eastern Germany had a wall, right? So people will build walls for various reasons. Sometimes people build walls to keep their people in if they have an oppressive government, or if they have a place that people want to be, they may create a wall to keep people out. But the point of a wall is to establish a more enforceable border, and that should not be controversial because every nation has borders. In fact, most nations who have borders have stricter laws than the United States. And I can point to no better example of a nation that has more strict policies of immigration than us, than Mexico. Try to go to Mexico and establish citizenship there. It will not happen. Try to legally get a working visa there. This is a strict process. And so people who say, oh, it's racist how we do things here. Well, you may have that opinion and you can make that argument if you want to, but you cannot make the argument that is an extreme, right? That you can't do and not be taken seriously. Here's another big Trump push is domestic production. Domestic production. In other words, allowing the United States to produce its own resources. That's not extremism. And again, you could support Trump. You may not like how he says it, or you may love how he says it. Regardless, it is not an extremist position to say, we will allow you to dig up the resources that are in our own country since we're buying it anyway on the world market. To me, that's not extremism. It's hard for me as an economics major. It is really hard for me to understand how somebody could support somebody saying the opposite. To me, the opposite view is extremist because almost every nation that has resources takes advantage of its own resources, whether that be the rare earths in China, whether that be in Canada, right? Whether that be in Africa when they get all the gold and the ivory. And we talk about all these movies about the blood diamonds and things like that. And the point of it being is that it is very rare to find a nation that has its resources that it could take and instead will enrich another nation to get the same resources it could get for itself. To me, that doesn't make sense. So to say that getting your own resources is extremism is a ridiculous argument. Trump's other argument is to renegotiate NAFTA. That's not an extremist view. People on the left have been critical of NAFTA. People on the right have been critical of NAFTA. Now, he created this great trade deal. Most people encourage it. Most people endorse it. I don't see how that's an extremist view. The individual mandate was repealed. The fine was appealed. Some people supported it, some people didn't. It is really hard to say that's an extremist view. When people talk about the extremism in Trump, I think what they're really referring to is just how he said things. Because even if you look at things like his so-called Muslim ban, which some people might consider extremism, look at the fact that Biden also has bans on nations that can come here or not based on their coronavirus policies. So my point is that when you look at Trump, You can make an argument that some of the things he does in extremism, but if you want to act like we have to treat this as some whole new brand of thing that has never appeared in American politics, you will be out of place saying that. It will not be a fair argument. So, is it whataboutism to compare Black Lives Matter protest to the Capitol riots? No, it's not. Because they were both protests against things that people didn't like, and they really were not the best way to address those situations. If you don't like the fact that the police did something to somebody, you need to charge those people, and you need to change the laws accordingly. If you don't like the fact that you think the election was stolen from Trump, you need to prove that those elections were stolen, and you need to change the laws accordingly. And that's just really what it is. And both of them, to me, was both protests a little bit about spoiled milk, because a lot of times when you had these Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of them didn't even have all the facts before they just start tearing crap up. A lot of them were people just taking advantage of situations and just looting a Walmart. How did looting a Walmart make a black person more powerful? And that's the kind of stuff that I really was against. And I think that it hurt the black community more than it helped it, just like the Trump riots, right? The Trump riots didn't endear anybody to Trump. The Capitol riots didn't make anybody on the right feel better about Trump. It didn't persuade anybody who didn't already like Trump to say, man, that's a good dude. It didn't do that. It was stupid. It hurt his cause. The same with the Black Lives Matter protests. They hurt their cause. So I think they are very comparable. And I don't think it's a whataboutism to compare the two of them. But hey, you are free to make the argument to otherwise. But when I see it, I'm going to counter it, because I don't think that it makes any sense. So hey, if you got any opinions about what we're saying on this channel, definitely be free to comment. I might make a video in response. I want to hear from you guys. I want to make reasonable arguments. I want to counter reasonable arguments. I want to hear from people and engage you. So hey, keep on posting. We're going to keep on posting. In fact, we're going to post even more in the future. As you see, I got my little hat here. I was under the weather the last few days, so I haven't been posting as much as I really should be. But I got my hat here supporting WAGS, the comic book. So if you guys want to support good values, entertainment, definitely get behind WAGS, the Warrior of Truth. And you can learn more and more about this as you watch more of our videos. This is our effort to create a revolution in entertainment, where we create good entertainment, but again, entertainment that produces values in and of itself. Anyways, check us out. Keep on liking, keep on subscribing, and we'll see you guys next time.